Hey everyone, Joey Amanza here and welcome to my YouTube channel. I am a third year student currently studying psychology and philosophy part-time at UNISA. Although my love of philosophy far predates my official studying of it. Like Socrates says, or Plato's Socrates, maybe more specifically, philosophy begins with wonder. And that's how it began for me. I remember being awestruck, flabbergasted, uh, unnerved, and a little frightened when I contemplated the sheer brute fact of existence, right? Like, how did it bootstrap itself into where I am now? What are its structures? What are its dynamics? These questions really niggled at me. And as I sort of tugged that string further, pulled it, I found myself wading into the waters of consciousness and trying to orient myself in that domain, sample different theories, see what the discourse is saying, and I started to notice that what would sometimes happen is that people would be arguing here, but the real bone of contention is actually a level deeper, right? So if, for example, a physicalist and an idealist are debating, just for example, there are other positions. If they're debating, they will be talking past one another because they haven't explicated their metaphysical outlook, and that instead of explicating it, it remains implicit and serves as a sort of barrier to further understanding. And so that's what this video will be about: metaphysics. How do metaphysics and science relate to each other? So yeah, let's go. Right, so that is our question for this video. What is the relation between metaphysics and science? On one end of the extreme, you could go, the route of Pierre Duhem was a 19th century physicist who thought that metaphysics was the queen of the sciences, right? It's on top or at the bottom if we're talking about fundamentality. We swing the pendulum to the other extreme and we have the logical positivists like Kane, who thought that metaphysics, strictly speaking, was meaningless, right? It didn't have any meaning because it could not be empirically verified. Then you could have like a Locke, for example, who's very important if we're analyzing the trajectory of materialism slash physicalism and his idea of primary and secondary qualities, which Berkeley then sort of had some rebuttals for. That's for another video. But he thought that philosophers are like humble underlaborers, right? We're just sort of clearing the debris and raking the leaves on the road so that the scientists may walk down it more smoothly. But it's like, Alex Gomez Marine says, put your metaphysics on the table. I'd say, put your metaphysics on the table. So in this video, what we're going to do is go through a number of thinkers who have tackled this topic and provide some commentary on it and synthesize them, show which ones I feel are better than the other ones. So we'll start with Kane B, has a YouTube channel and he's great. He made this video on metaphysics and science, which was very illuminating. Then we'll go to Nikolai Pilgard, who is he has a channel called Nature or Reality, and it is criminally underrated. I think it's a stinging indictment on where we are as a species that his channel doesn't have more numbers for it. But yeah, I would highly recommend him. He's got some great videos. He has one on metaphysics that I'll be talking about. Go to Karl Popper next. He was also interesting because he was contemporaneous with Carnap, and so he has some differences of opinion in regarding metaphysics and science and how to see those. So that's interesting. And then we'll go into a paper by L.A. June, which loosely is titled as Metaphysics, the Handmaiden of Science. And even though Kane B touches on her paper, he doesn't really do like a deep dive, so I'm going to do a bit more of a dive into it because I enjoyed seeing that and reading that theory. I agree with quite a bit of it. And lastly, we'll have Claudia Ribeiro, who I think gave very perspicacious demarcation of metaphysics and science. With an addendum I'd put at the end, but that'll be for later. For now, let us begin with Kane B. Okay, so Kane B very helpfully lists out a number of challenges that metaphysics will have to overcome in order to prove itself as a valid form of inquiry. Now, this is because metaphysics, especially traditional metaphysics, has come under some scrutiny the last couple of centuries. And so it's sort of starting on the back foot and will have to actively justify itself. Now, there are a number of strands, that go into this anti-metaphysical attitude, but I think one of the main ones was the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution of the 16th, 17th century. This helped, I think, sort of start fomenting anti-metaphysical attitudes. And this is partly because, if we look at the Enlightenment primarily as an epistemological revolution instead of an ontological one, that sort of shifts, the landscape a little bit. Because what normally happens is that physicalists will fuse together the success of science and their underlying ontology of science and say that those two things mutually support each other and they can't be set apart. But if you look at the Enlightenment rather as an epistemological revolution, right, whereby intuition, spiritual revelation, holy books, tradition, all these things are, as epistemic organs, are devalued, and the important thing rather is observation, experimentation, and reasoning on these observables, as well as quantification using sort of the precision of mathematics to help tease apart different hypotheses and theses and results. And so seeing the Enlightenment from this vantage point means that the underlying ontology of the scientific revolution, which was broadly mechanistic and materialist, that ontology no longer becomes it no longer becomes a default view, right? You don't have to speak about the success of science as necessarily entailing the ontological commitments of this theory. The only thing you need to sort of get to the success of science is to think about it in an epistemological sense. And so in that case, the ontology is kind of parasitic on the actual epistemological revolution, and it sort of helped calcify the sort of underlying ontology with the success of science, which I don't think is strictly necessary. So the first challenge that Kane B sort of poses to metaphysics regards, you could call it like the armchair challenge. How can, armchair metaphysics be a genuine epistemic organ that is providing us with substantive knowledge about the world itself? With science, you go out there, you measure things, you observe things, you publish papers, you quantify things. How can the philosopher, just by sitting on his chair and thinking a lot, suddenly arrive at sort of these grand statements? And so with the armchair challenge, it sort of brings me back to Ribeiro and Ade Paul. Those are the two things I mentioned earlier, and I'll be sort of tackling them in other videos. But one of the things they touch on in trying to demarcate metaphysics and science is to speak about the high levels of generality of metaphysics versus the particularity of the empirical sciences. That's one way to sort of demarcate them. And I think that if we look at nominalism, the thesis that there are no universals, and we sort of put universals and generalities conceptually side by side, you can see how nominalism, with its rejection of universals / generalities, can lead to anti-metaphysical attitudes, as metaphysics as an inquiry is almost like indelibly general. Like, that's its nature. And so if you start questioning generalities with sort of nominalist influence, then you can see how the nominalist strand can downstream lead to sort of anti-metaphysical attitudes. And it's interesting because Matt Siegel, in a conversation with Tim Jackson, uh, he said something very interesting in that we need to bring back thinking about efficacious generalities, right? We need to get back to that mode, and I think that's touched on the issue very well, right? There's this whole lineage of sort of trying to think of efficacious generalities. There were sort of Plato's forms, and then they sort of became laws of nature, and different ways to construe it. But it's interesting to consider how this nominalist disavowal of universals can lead to some anti-metaphysical attitudes, although it doesn't necessarily have to. The second challenge that can be posed is that has metaphysics not been usurped by science, right? Has science not sort of taken on the domain of philosophy and taken it over, right? And I think this is a interesting criticism, but I think it sort of misunderstands the metametaphysics of the thing, because if you treat metaphysics and empirical science as disciplines that are causal rivals, right? They're making competing causal claims. Then that metametaphysical outlook would be sort of wrong-headed, at least in my opinion. And it's questions about space, time, causality. Right? You don't go to a metaphysician to answer these questions. You go to a physicist, right? And again, I'll sort of cite Matt Siegel here, who he's just a great thinker. I think he was talking to Tim Jackson again, but that's neither here nor there. Siegel was talking about this debate between Sean Carroll, who I think is a physicalist broadly, and he's partial to the many worlds interpretation, against Philip Goff, who's on his panpsychism trip. And so Siegel's watching this, and he sees that Sean Carroll would sort of make this move, right, where he'd tell Philip Goff, it's all well and good sort of putting consciousness at the fundamental level of reality, but if you're going to do that, then where are these consciousness fields for us to detect, right? We have like quark fields, Higgs fields, electromagnetic fields. If you're going to posit, this fundamental consciousness, where is the consciousness field? Like, you have to add to our science in order to make it work that this consciousness is an underlying field. And I think this is a prime example of treating metaphysics and empirical science as causal rivals, whereas I would sort of construe the relationship differently. Another potential criticism is that it's clear when science is making progress, whereas metaphysical debates just seem to sort of loop in these interminable circles. Right? There's no way to like truly build a defeasible or an indefeasible case. It doesn't seem like metaphysics has that. And last criticism was that metaphysically analyzing or metaphysically grounding these sort of categories from the empirical sciences doesn't add anything to our knowledge base. It's not doing anything. It's just like almost like a hobby or something, but nothing that can really make a tangible difference in like how science is done or the sort of experiments that science is willing to participate in. So, the first metametaphysical outlook that Kane details is complementary metaphysics. Although it should be noted that Kane is citing Carl P. Stanford's article, So Long and Thanks for the Fish, when he's talking about these three metametaphysical outlooks. So you're kind of getting this like double diluted, because I'm citing Kane who cited Carl P. Stanford, and in the case of complementary metaphysics, Carl P. Stanford refers to L.A. June, right? He sees L.A. June as the primary exemplar of complementary metaphysics. So quite a lot of names sort of, floating about here, but I'll try to be clear when I'm talking about who said what and how these ideas sort of overlap. But yeah, I mean, L.A. June's paper, like I said, we'll be doing a deeper dive into that paper later. For now, we're just going to stick with complementary metaphysics, whose main contention is that science and metaphysics are demarcated by their subject matter and not their methodologies. And this might be strange for some people, because it's generally thought that the empirical sciences and the theoretical metaphysics are sort of diametrically opposed, right? One is empirical and the other one is very abstract. But what L.A. June tries to show is that methodological tools like inference to the best explanation, thought experiments, idealizations, abstract modeling, these methodological tools are not proprietary to science, right? The metaphysics also makes liberal use of these methodologies. And, that's why, in Carl P. Stanford's abstract, I have a small, bone to pick with that, because he basically says complementary metaphysics tries to use, in quotes, what it regards as the methods of science itself. And that seems to be missing the point a little bit of what L.A. June was saying, because how I understood her, she was saying that these shared methodological overlaps between metaphysics and science are there because these methodologies are not native to science, they're not proprietary to science. And so when he says the methods of science itself, he's kind of falling into that subtle trap that L.A. June was trying to navigate around. But that's a small just a small quibble. So if metaphysics and science are demarcated by their subject matter, how does this work? L.A. June basically says that metaphysics' subject matter is to try to find the general fundamental truths of reality. And while that might seem to sort of overlap with physics, right, if you're a reductive physicalist, because aren't the physicists trying to find out the most general and fundamental truths of reality? And L.A. June sort of counters like this. She basically says metaphysical concepts are prior to empirical ones, right? And you can see this basically if we're thinking about if let's say a physicist is trying to detail like the spin of a particular quark or something. I don't even know if they have spin. But let's say he wants to do that. Before he can say that I want to study this specific property like spin, he needs to know what is a property, right? Same thing with composition, right? If you want to know like what are the compositional elements of a protein, right? Metaphysics will ask what is composition itself, right? And that's prior to asking how this generality is sort of instantiated. And so by sort of approaching things like that, you can sort of delineate where how metaphysics as subject matter is more foundational than sciences, because the same way you could see the empirical sciences sort of as using mathematical tools, they're also, if unwittingly, using metaphysical tools as well. And this is how L.A. June sort of justifies why physics or empirical science in general is less fundamental than the lines of inquiry in metaphysics. Another way to sort of approach this is to talk about the Duhem-Quine thesis, right? And this is the same Duhem, that I mentioned in the introductory, who thought that metaphysics was the queen of the sciences. And this is a thesis about underdetermination. Because empirical evidence underdetermines which theories can account for it, therefore you need these trans-empirical methodological tools that will shed some light on this. It's not enough just to point at a piece of evidence, right? What's normally happening is if you point at a piece of evidence, you're bringing to bear a framework that's implicit. And so what underdetermination of empirical evidence, what that sort of affirms is why empirical science needs to make use of trans-empirical methodological tools in order to choose between different theoretical options, right? You need to use explanatory virtues, as Kane said. And one more sort of way that complementary physics would cash out demarcating metaphysics and the empirical sciences is that the empirical sciences work at particular length scales, right? So physics deals with the really small, and then you go into chemistry, and then you go into biology. These different fields have a scope, a particular scope of things. Metaphysics, on the other hand, seems invariant to scale, right? That's why Kane he used the example that the compositional rules for quarks and for galaxies are the same, right? Because metametaphysics is trying to figure out what composition is. And so that's why you need trans-empirical methods to be able to pick between theories which are empirically equivalent. And lastly, it seems like what metaphysics has is a level of independence from the particularities, right? This is just sort of rehashing what is just said. It's the compositional principles would still hold if if a nucleus was made out of 3 quarks rather than 4. The particular specificities don't matter because metaphysics is trying to address these things at a more general level. So next, Kane took us to some of the criticisms that can be levied against complementary metaphysics. The first of these critiques, which was given by Stanford in his article, was that these metaphysical categories and concepts, they don't really add anything to our knowledge base. Right? Like, it's how can, thinking about whether a property is a universal or a trope, or if we're like using a substance attribute metaphysics versus a process relational one, like what does that add? Is there any substantive content in choosing those options that will help us understand the objective world more? And that's an interesting criticism. It makes me think about Patrick Harper. He has this book called I think Field Guide to the Other World. I haven't finished the book, but I've sort of sampled different sections, and it's been very rewarding. And one thing he mentioned was that in the West, it's sort of, if we're speaking broadly, it has a Herculean ego complex. And, if we think about it from a Jungian perspective, a psychological complex, is this knot of psychic materials which are equipped with a suite of dispositions that they have towards events that they encounter, right? And so if we think about this Herculean hero complex, right, as a sort of Jungian psychological complex, it has certain patterns that we can sort of lay out. And so this Herculean ego, it's always very forward moving, right? It's like you can think of it also as a sun hero, because the sun can be symbolized as a goal or a target that we want to reach, right? The sun can symbolize that. And the hero likes things delineated very clearly, right? And that's what the sun does. It demarcates objects in a way that isn't ambiguous, right? The Herculean ego lacks a tolerance for ambiguity, doesn't like moving backwards. Now, it's interesting for a couple of reasons. Auguste Comte, right? You could say, was the founder of positivism, and he said of positivism, that it's simply the degree to which phenomena can be exactly determined, right? And that's the Herculean sun hero complex there, right? Things need to be exactly determined. It's also interesting that he uses the word add anything, and this has a positivist slant, right? Add and positive are very linked. That's interesting as well. And for me, when I was sort of deconverting from physicalism, deconverting is a dramatic word. What I mean is that it stopped being like a default obvious choice and just became like one view of many, which are sort of all empirically equivalent. When I had to do that, it wasn't like I was starting in physicalism, then let's say walking towards idealism. I also had to deconstruct physicalism, which means I had to take some backward steps before I could sort of start moving forward again. And so, if you're looking for like the presupposition of a certain line of inquiry or whatever, looking for presuppositions is necessarily looking backwards, right? It's retracing your steps, and the Herculean son hero complex, doesn't like that. That it wants to move forward. It wants things to be clear. It wants to attack, let's say, the dragon in the cave. Like that's its MO, and yeah, it really comes to bear on this criticism. You can sort of see how this complex can arrive at a certain view of metaphysics that says that it doesn't add anything because metaphysics isn't taking any forward steps, right? What it does is it typically, this line criticism and the people who levy it, they'll say that these things are merely verbal disputes or they're just concepts in the head. And I think that this is also, tied to the nominalism strand, where they sort of rejected universals, and that was like a tacit rejection of these like lofty generalities of metaphysics, and psychologizes them, or makes them verbal disputes, or just concepts in the head. And yeah, so if we look at those two strands, the Herculean son hero complex and the nominalism strand, you can sort of see why their dispositions lead them in certain directions. And I don't even think it's necessarily true that these metaphysical concepts don't add anything to anything, because if we think about Michael Levin, who I think he's just he's great, and his whole thing about agential patterns and cognitive light cones, just mind blowing. But he said something that was very interesting. He was saying that with his fellow biologists, they would say things like, I like the work you're doing, but like this philosophy stuff that you're going into, and like, he's moving in an idealist direction, it seems like to me. They would say things like that, like, love the biology, but this philosophy stuff isn't really necessary, right? And he countered that by saying these experiments that he did to sort of demonstrate that maybe like cells could be cognitive agents, he did this series of experiments, him and his team, and he said that why weren't these experiments done beforehand, right? Like in the way that his team did it specifically. And for him, his answer was it was because he was working from a different framework, right? The philosophical framework that he was operating within allowed him to say, hey, let me use some of the tools in cognitive science, use them with these cells, and see what happens. And the cells start to seem like they're cognitive agents. So these metaphysical categories and schemes and frameworks, they implicitly guide what you're looking for and what you're going to predict, and the certain sorts of experiments that you feel are feasible versus the ones that you don't. And so that's also important to keep in mind. The second criticism is that metaphysical disputes are open to scientific refutation, right? One example that was given by Kane was mereology. If we think about mereology as a study between parts and wholes and their relations, it seems to be assuming a sort of atomist foundation where you have the one thing here and another thing there, and they sort of interact. But the argument goes, quantum field theory has moved past that. It's not about atoms, it's more about like patterns of activity or something like that. And so if you have a mereologist, let's say, who's coming from the land of philosophy, and they're trying to apply these tools to, like, let's say, quantum mechanics, they would be mistaken because they're having an atomistic foundation. And that's one way in which, a metaphysical dispute in mereology can be open to scientific refutation, and it shows that the scientific or empirical methods are in that sense superior to, let's say, trans-empirical a priori ones. Yeah. Okay, so the next metametaphysical outlook that can be touched upon is scientific metaphysics. This framework basically says that our metaphysical questions are best answered by using scientific methods and scientific content. For example, we could think about Zeno's paradox, right? This paradox of motion. How can this arrow travel an infinite amount of steps? There have been some who have tried to answer this question by thinking about differential equations and their use of infinitesimals. What this would be doing is showing how, these differential equations are typically placed in a scientific box, can be used to answer questions that were originally posed in traditional metaphysics. Scientific metaphysics also differs from complementary metaphysics because it doesn't think that metaphysical questions are more fundamental or prior to scientific ones. The prime exemplar used by Stanford and echoed by Kane is Ladyman and Ross, who wrote this book, Everything Must Go. And they tried to strike a balance. They didn't want to eliminate metaphysics, but they didn't want to sort of fall into the sort of extravagant metaphysical speculations that can be proffered by some traditional metaphysicians. However, the Durham-Quine thesis also states that, evidence underdetermines theory, and so you'll always have many empirically equivalent theories, and in order to pick a theory, you'll need to do trans-empirical investigations. And so these two sides of the fence is trying to find a middle way, right? It doesn't want to go into speculative, excessive metaphysics, but it doesn't want to also go into, taking evidence and empirical data as uniquely determining one theory. And with this mode of metaphysics, they think that the main goal of metaphysics should be to try and unite the sciences, right? Because no one is really trying to do that. We've got scientists who are locked into their particular domains. There is interdisciplinary meshing as well. But for the most part, you have different lines of inquiry siloed in their particular domain of interest. And so if we want someone who's specifically going to try and unite these different sciences and how they influence and interact with each other, this would be the job of the metaphysician, not to sort of use metaphysics to jump off into empirically unverifiable statements and proffers. What metaphysics is supposed to do is just to unite the sciences. Okay, now we go on to the potential criticisms of scientific metaphysics. The first one sort of runs like this. If we're going to ground our metaphysics in some sort of scientific content, then we run into the pessimistic meta-induction. The pessimistic meta-induction is typically used sort of as the first hurdle that a scientific realist needs to overcome to give a satisfying account of how sort of scientific theories and their content map onto reality. If we look at the history of science, right, we can see that different theories have been proposed and then changed subsequently with more superior theories, right? Like a Newtonian paradigm would have absolute space and time, whereas a relativistic one wouldn't have that. It would have sort of, non-Euclidean space, and in quantum mechanics, space-time might not even be fundamental. So, and if we extrapolate this pattern into the future, we can assume that the theories we hold now will be further usurped by other theories. Hence why it's a pessimistic meta-induction. And so it seems like basing our metaphysical questions in scientific content is dubious because it's sort of a shaky ground. Like, science changes. That's why metaphysics as well sometimes tries to not embroil itself too deeply in the empirics of a situation, because those are subject to change, and so it's difficult to see how this could account for a theory change, right? The scientific metaphysics perspective. One route that someone may go is if we're thinking about Ladyman and Ross earlier that we read, they think that quantum field theory is it justifies a sort of ontic structural realism, or OSR for short. And this OSR basically is a counterpoint to the pessimistic meta-induction, and so that's a potential escape route from this criticism, right? QFT is no longer, or at least ontic structural realism rather, is an argument that can sort of rebuff the pessimistic meta-induction, because instead of being committed to the entities that you posit in your science, rather stick to the structure, right? The structure is what's invariant across theory change. And so if you go that route, then you've sort of, you've leaped over the pessimistic induction hurdle. Second criticism could be, if it's the metaphysician's job to unite these different scientific domains, how are they going to do that with no formal training in those domains, right? How can a metaphysician who's not trained in physics or chemistry or microbiology or anthropology, it's not clear that they would be the right sort of people to facilitate this process. And so, if this is a successful criticism, then you would have to sort of rebuke metaphysics as a valid line of inquiry. Okay, so the third metametaphysical outlook that we'll be looking at is metaphysics of science. This is the third and last one that Stanford lists in his article. Kane in his video also covers this, and he adds another one that we will be getting to in the next slide. So metaphysics of science, we can kind of think of it as an inverse to scientistic metaphysics. Whereas scientistic metaphysics wants to use scientific methodologies and bring them to bear on philosophical issues, metaphysics of science wants to use metaphysical tools like conceptual analysis, thought experiments, modal reasoning, about necessity, possibility, impossibility. It wants to use these tools and bring it to bear on scientific issues. It wants to tease out what the ontological commitments of the theories are and sort of unveil them, because what normally happens is the ontological commitments they sneak in through the back, right? And they don't necessarily the sun doesn't get to clarify them with its light. Metaphysics of science and scientistic metaphysics do, however, agree in both rejecting the claim from traditional metaphysics that metaphysics should be positing its own entities, or that it's the most foundational inquiry that is possible, right? Metaphysics and scientific metaphysics both kind of limit metaphysics to the realm of the scientific, the empirical scientific. And so with metaphysics of science, it's not necessarily speaking about reality itself. All it's doing is trying to uncover what particular theories' ontological commitments are. Stanford, for what it's worth, he sort of sees this one as the most alluring of the three. And yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And now on to potential criticisms for the metaphysics of science. Kane lists a couple. I'm just gonna go with two here and sort of leap into them. The first criticism is that it isn't obvious to see how theories have these hidden implicit ontological presuppositions, right? If you want to know what a theory's ontological commitments are, just present the theory, right? There's no need to do this metaphysical investigation into it. It's not adding anything. This line of criticism is similar to one we saw earlier, where I was talking about the Herculean ego, right? And its sun complex, or its solar aspect, of wanting to always be moving forward, being very single-minded, and always wants to sort of jump into the fray of the action. Once again, when you start questioning whether these theories have any sort of ontological presuppositions that are hidden, right? They're not exactly manifest in the theory itself. Then that to a Herculean solar psychic complex, it doesn't have a blind spot, right? Everything is clear, everything is visible, and everything is unambiguous. And so for that sort of complex, everything is explicit and manifest already. There aren't shadows hiding, behind objects or anything like that. And so, if you're operating within that sort of psychic complex, it does make sense to be skeptical about whether these ontologies have presuppositions. Whereas, for me, I just kind of look at it phenomenologically, right? I have my attention focused in two ways. I got focal attention and peripheral awareness. Now, but behind the peripheral awareness, there's just nothing, right? And so to question whether there are hidden ontological presuppositions in our scientific theories, to say that these theories don't have any ontological presupposition, to me is the same as someone focusing on their focal attention while denying that they have a peripheral scope, and behind the peripheral scope there's just nothing. It's sort of the same move to me. And another potential criticism is that, as established earlier by L.A. June, science does use these trans-empirical methods, such as they use these methods that are idealistic, right? They use idealizations, they use abstractions, and by using these, they're able to simplify a lot of complex calculations. However, it is not clear at all when we're looking at a theory, right? Which parts of the theory are supposed to be read ontologically, and then which parts are sort of like mathematical niceties or mathematical tricks, right? Is a configuration space, like, are we going to give that a sort of ontologically real status, or is it just a handy metaphysical trick that we can use to simplify? It's not necessarily easy to tell from the theory itself, which parts of the theory fall where. And this can then undermine any attempts to draw some metaphysical underpinnings, because if you use these underpinnings, you have to somehow select which part of the theory is supposed to be taken, as ontological, and which part is supposed to be taken as a neat mathematical tool. It's hard then to know, when you're trying to uncover the ontology, which sections of the theory should be taken ontologically. And I think that is quite a valid criticism, and it's definitely something that people should be aware of when they're trying to read these theories ontologically, right? That sometimes we use these idealizations, like the example that Kane used was using idealized gases in solar entity. In stellar stellar entities, right? We know that idealized perfect gases don't actually exist, but they are used to find out things about these different stellar entities that are populating the universe. And so if you wanted to look at the ontological commitments, are you going to say that these idealized gases are also ontologically real, or are they not? And how do you justify those two things? And so I think that is definitely a criticism that metaphysics of science should be wary of. Okay, and lastly we have Neo-Kantian metaphysics. This one wasn't included in Stanford's article. This was an addition, from in Kane video when he was covering all these topics. Neo-Kantian metaphysics basically wants to find what are the transcendental sort of presuppositions of scientific practice. How this differs from metaphysics of science is that metaphysics of science wants to uncover the ontological commitments of scientific theories and scientific concepts. Neo-Kantian metaphysics wants to find the presuppositions of scientific practice, right? What are the things we need to presuppose in order for observation to even be possible? It's kind of like what John Vervaeke says. He says, when you're trying to speak about a particular scientific theory, don't just look at its content. Look at its presuppositions too, right? That's when you get a complete overview of what scientific theory kind of entails. this would run into similar issues of the positivist's unwillingness to look back, because you want to be a positive addition, taking forward steps. Craning your neck back isn't very solar. It isn't very enlightening in the sense of providing clarity. It's more like sort of digging into the dark roots of the bark of the tree of your soul, and navigating through that dark ambiguity. Positivists, or at least the attitude that can underlie positivism, which as we've said, is the Herculean ego complex that follows, is solar in their nature. And for what it's worth, I think my sort of temperament is actually more like moon, water, fog. And so I'm always kind of turning back on myself, and that can be beneficial but also hamper you in terms of just being someone who can execute and really just motivate themselves and be ambitious. An example of neo-Kantian metaphysics that Kane mentioned, because I think he was citing an article in this regard, is the PSV, right? And this is the principle of single value. It's an example of the sort of thing that neo-Kantian metaphysics will want to uncover, right? And so when you're measuring something, you can only have one value of the thing. You can't measure like a TV that's 15 centimeters and 20 centimeters at the same time. That's not even legible. So the principle of single value would be one of these sort of transcendental presuppositions. Another reason is that it's not amenable to empirical investigation, right? It would be the same thing, like Kane says, of trying to observe and investigate every bachelor to check if they're unmarried, right? You can't. That's just not what's possible. And one way to be able to tell, what is something that's empirically verifiable versus like a transcendental presupposition is, can you imagine a counterexample, like legibly? If I'm like doing some empirical research, let's say on a group of baboons, and these baboons, I make a prediction that if one of them makes a noise, they will scatter in this direction, right? Now, I could legibly conceive of another possibility where the monkeys hear that noise and they don't do what's predicted, so you can conceive of both. But the principle of single value, the reason why the married bachelor was used is because, can you conceive of a single counterexample of a bachelor not being unmarried, right? That it doesn't really even make sense. Same thing for the principle of single value. If you were to try and say, this thing that I'm measuring can have two values, right? It's both, like I say, 15 centimeters or 20 centimeters. That, in some sense, would be a confusion, right? And that's how you can sort of start to tease apart the transcendental presupposition aspect of a theory versus the empirical content that is actually subject to falsifiability. So yeah, thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like and a subscribe. Even if you didn't, just be a good Samaritan. Next week we'll be covering Nikolai Pilgard's metametaphysical outlooks. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but he has the channel called The Nature of Reality, and I'm super excited to dig in. So yeah, thank you.